Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. Story 1. The Witching Hour. I've always been a night owl, but lately, something strange has been happening. It started about a month ago, when I first noticed the pattern. Every time I glanced at the clock, it was 3:33 a.m. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence, a quirk of my sleep cycle. But as the nights went on, the eerie consistency began to unsettle me. It was a Tuesday when I first became truly alarmed. I had been tossing and turning in bed, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. When I finally gave in to my insomnia and checked the time, it was 3:33 a.m. My heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. There was no logical explanation for why this time kept appearing, but the fear it instilled in me was undeniable. That night, I woke with a start. My room was shrouded in darkness, save for the faint glow of the moonlight seeping through the curtains. The air was thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. I reached for my phone to check the time, and once again, it was 3:33 a.m. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed something else. The digital clock on my nightstand was also frozen at 3:33. I tried to shake off the unease and drifted back to sleep, but the next morning, a sense of dread lingered. I went through my day in a daze, unable to focus on work or conversations. That night, the same thing happened. Waking at 3:33 a.m., the clock's all frozen, a creeping sense of fear gnawing at my sanity. Determined to understand what was happening, I began researching supernatural phenomena related to specific times. My search led me to the concept of the witching hour, traditionally believed to be a time when the veil between the living and the dead is thinnest. It was a chilling thought, but I wasn't one to believe in such things. At least, not until now. Desperate for answers, I visited an antique shop in town known for its collection of esoteric books. The shopkeeper, a wizened old man with a knowing glint in his eye, seemed to sense my distress. Without a word, he handed me a dusty tome titled The Witching Hour and Beyond. I devoured the book, finding tales of spirits trapped in time, entities that could manipulate clocks to convey messages from the beyond. One story, in particular, caught my attention. It spoke of a spirit bound to 3:33 a.m., seeking to communicate with the living. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Was I being haunted? That night, I went to bed with a sense of trepidation. My eyes darted to the clock every few minutes, anxiety mounting as the hours ticked by. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and when I woke, gasping for breath, the clock read 3:33 a.m. Hey, subscribe for more scary stories. The dream haunted me long after I woke. The image of that shadowy figure burned into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The clocks, the dreams, the oppressive feeling in my home, it all pointed to one thing. I was being haunted, and whatever it was, it wanted something from me. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to visit the shopkeeper again. His knowing glance the first time I visited suggested he might have more information. When I walked into the shop, the air was thick with the scent of old books and incense. The shopkeeper looked up from his counter, his eyes narrowing as he saw me. "I knew you'd be back," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "You're dealing with something powerful. Something ancient." I explained what had been happening, the clocks, the dreams, and the oppressive feeling. He listened intently, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he sighed deeply. "You're dealing with a time-bound spirit," he said. "These spirits are connected to a specific moment in time, often the moment of their death. They're trapped, unable to move on, and they latch onto the living, hoping to find a way to free themselves." The shopkeeper handed me a small, ornate box. "Inside this box is an amulet," he said. "It's meant to protect you from the spirit's influence. But be warned, using it could anger the spirit." I took the box, feeling its weight in my hand. I had no choice. I had to try something, anything, to stop this haunting. That night, I placed the amulet under my pillow and went to bed. As I drifted off, I hoped the amulet would keep the spirit at bay. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The room was cold, the air thick with a sense of malevolence. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:33 a.m., but this time, the clock wasn't frozen. The seconds ticked by, a small comfort in the midst of my fear. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room. I turned, and there it was, the shadowy figure from my dream. It stood at the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. It pointed a bony finger at me, its mouth moving soundlessly. My blood ran cold as I realized it was trying to communicate. Gathering my courage, I reached for the amulet. As soon as I touched it, the figure recoiled, its form flickering. It let out a silent scream, the force of its anger shaking the room. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving me gasping for breath. The next day, I knew I needed to learn more about the spirit. I returned to the shopkeeper, who suggested I visit the local library. There, I found records of a woman who had died under mysterious circumstances in my house, precisely at 3:33 a.m. Her name was Eliza, and she had been accused of witchcraft in the late 1800s. Eliza's story was tragic. Falsely accused and executed, her spirit had become trapped, reliving the moment of her death every night. I felt a pang of sympathy for her, but I also knew I had to find a way to free her spirit if I ever wanted peace. That night, I prepared for what I hoped would be my final encounter with Eliza. Armed with the amulet and the knowledge I had gained, I waited for the witching hour, determined to confront the spirit and end the haunting once and for all. As the minutes ticked by, I could feel my anxiety mounting. I clutched the amulet tightly, hoping it would protect me as it had before. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My eyes were glued to the clock on my nightstand, watching as the numbers changed, each second bringing me closer to 3:33 a.m. When the clock finally struck 3:33, a chill swept through the room. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and I knew Eliza was there. The shadowy figure materialized at the foot of my bed, just as she had in my dreams. This time, however, I was ready. "Eliza," I said, my voice trembling. "I know what happened to you. I know you were falsely accused and executed. I'm here to help you find peace." The figure flickered, her eyes glowing with a mix of anger and sorrow. She moved closer, her mouth forming words I couldn't hear. I reached for the book the shopkeeper had given me, flipping to the section on time-bound spirits. According to the text, I needed to perform a ritual to help Eliza's spirit move on. With shaking hands, I began to recite the incantation. The words felt foreign on my tongue, but I forced myself to continue, my voice growing stronger with each syllable. Eliza's form wavered, her eyes wide with surprise. As I spoke, I could feel a shift in the air, as if the very fabric of time was being altered. Suddenly, Eliza let out a piercing scream, her figure dissolving into a whirlwind of shadows. The room shook, objects flying off the shelves as the spirit's anger and pain were unleashed. I clung to the amulet, focusing on the incantation, praying it would be enough to free her. Just as I thought I couldn't take any more, the room fell silent. The shadows dissipated, and the oppressive feeling lifted. I opened my eyes to find the clock ticking normally, the numbers changing as the seconds passed. Eliza was gone. Exhausted, I collapsed onto the bed, the adrenaline slowly leaving my system. I had done it. I had freed her spirit. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The house was quiet, too quiet, and a nagging doubt crept into my mind. The next day, I decided to investigate further. I returned to the library, poring over records and old newspapers. I discovered that Eliza had a daughter, Emily, who had mysteriously disappeared around the same time. It seemed the tragedy of Eliza's death extended beyond her own fate. I knew I had to find out what happened to Emily. If her spirit was also trapped, the haunting might not be over. I returned home, determined to uncover the truth. That night, I set up a camera in my bedroom, hoping to capture any supernatural activity. I wanted evidence, something concrete to prove I wasn't losing my mind. At 3:33 a.m., I woke to find the room filled with a strange light. The camera was recording, and I could see a faint figure in the corner of the room. It was smaller than Eliza, almost childlike. My heart raced as I realized I might be looking at Emily. I reached for the amulet, holding it out towards the figure. "Emily," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "If you're here, show me a sign." The figure moved closer, and I felt a gentle breeze brush my face. The clock on my nightstand ticked normally, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I knew then that my journey was far from over. Emily's spirit was still here, and I had to help her find peace, just as I had with her mother. The revelation that Emily's spirit lingered filled me with a mix of dread and determination. I couldn't abandon her, not after learning what she and her mother had endured. The next day, I returned to the shopkeeper, hoping he could offer more guidance. The old man listened quietly as I recounted the previous night's events, his eyes narrowing in thought. "It seems Emily is bound to this house, just like her mother," he said finally. "Their spirits are linked by the tragedy they suffered. To free Emily, you'll need to delve deeper into the history of your home and uncover the truth about her disappearance." I spent the next few days researching tirelessly. I combed through old records, spoke with local historians, and even visited the site where Eliza had been executed. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. Emily had been hidden away by a neighbor after her mother's death, but she had died of illness shortly after. Her spirit, confused and lost, had returned to the only place she knew as home. Armed with this knowledge, I prepared for what I hoped would be my final encounter with Emily. I set up the camera again, placed the amulet under my pillow, and recited the incantation I had used to free Eliza. This time, I included Emily's name, hoping to reach her spirit. As the clock neared 3:33 a.m., the familiar chill crept into the room. I sat up, heart pounding, and waited. The faint figure of Emily appeared in the corner, her small form shrouded in a soft, ethereal light. She looked at me with wide, sorrowful eyes, and I felt an overwhelming urge to help her. "Emily," I said softly, "I know what happened to you. I know you were scared and alone. But you don't have to be anymore. I'm here to help you find peace." Her figure wavered, and I could feel the temperature drop even further. I reached for the amulet, holding it out towards her. "Your mother is waiting for you, Emily. It's time for you to go to her." A gust of wind swept through the room, and Emily's form began to dissolve into the air. She let out a soft, heartbreaking cry, and I felt tears well up in my eyes. The clock struck 3:33 a.m., and as the seconds ticked by, Emily's spirit faded away, leaving the room silent and still. I checked the camera, watching the footage in awe. I had captured everything: the ethereal light, the figure of Emily, and her final, heartbreaking departure. I had proof of what I had experienced, but more importantly, I had freed both Eliza and Emily from their torment. The next few days passed in a blur. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in weeks. The clocks in my house returned to normal, and the oppressive feeling lifted. I knew the spirits were finally at rest, and my home was once again just a home. One evening, as I sat on the porch, I reflected on everything that had happened. The fear, the sleepless nights, the research, it had all been worth it to give Eliza and Emily the peace they deserved. I felt a sense of closure, knowing I had done the right thing. But as the sun set and the shadows grew long, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The unease crept back, and I glanced at my watch. It was 3:33 p.m. My heart skipped a beat. The time had followed me into the day. A cold breeze brushed past me, and I turned, expecting to see nothing. But there, standing at the edge of the porch, was a figure I didn't recognize. Taller than Eliza, older than Emily, its eyes glowed with an unsettling intensity. It seemed I had only scratched the surface of the haunting. The figure moved closer, and I felt the cold grip of fear tighten around my heart. This was far from over. The witching hour was just the beginning. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Soul-Eyes Doll. It was a damp, overcast afternoon when the package arrived. The air felt thick with an almost suffocating stillness, as if the world had paused to watch what was about to unfold. I found the plain brown box on my doorstep, unmarked except for my name scrawled in jagged letters across the top. There was no return address. A shiver ran down my spine as I picked it up, the weight oddly disproportionate to its size. Inside, nestled within crumpled newspaper, was a doll. It looked exactly like me, right down to the mole on my left cheek. But the eyes were sewn shut with thick, black thread. The sight of it made my heart race and my hands tremble. I could feel an unsettling energy emanating from it, a silent scream trapped within its stitched eyes. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was some sort of elaborate prank. But the unease clung to me, refusing to let go. I placed the doll on my kitchen table and sat down, staring at it as if it might suddenly spring to life. The longer I looked, the more I felt those stitched eyes watching me, judging me, despite their blindness. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside my window seemed amplified, echoing the dread that had settled in my chest. I kept the bedroom door open, unable to shake the feeling that I needed to keep an eye on the doll. I felt silly, but the fear was real, tangible. In the early hours of the morning, I woke with a start. My heart pounded in my chest, the remnants of a nightmare fading like shadows at dawn. I reached for my phone, its glow illuminating the dark room, and checked the time. It was 3:15 a.m. I rolled over, trying to find the comfort of sleep again, but the sense of being watched gnawed at me. The next day, I decided to investigate. I called my closest friends, asking if any of them had sent the doll as a joke. Their confusion and genuine concern only heightened my anxiety. I even took to social media, posting a picture of the doll with a caption asking for any information. The responses were swift but unhelpful, a mixture of jokes, sympathy, and wild theories. As days turned into a week, the doll became an unwelcome fixture in my life. Its presence was a constant reminder of the unknown threat lurking just out of sight. I moved it from room to room, trying to find a place where it didn't feel like it was invading my personal space. But no matter where I put it, those sewn eyes seemed to follow me, haunting my every move. It was on the 7th night that things took a turn for the worse. I woke again at 3:15 a.m., the air in my bedroom icy and still. I glanced at the doll, now sitting on my dresser, and felt a surge of terror. The threads on its eyes were coming loose, one stitch at a time. I watched in horrified fascination as the final thread snapped, and the doll's eyes opened. They were my eyes. I scrambled out of bed, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The doll sat there, its eyes, my eyes, staring back at me with a cold, unblinking intensity. My skin crawled with a sense of foreboding. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes. I had to get rid of the doll. Wrapping it in an old towel, I drove to the nearest dumpster and tossed it in, relieved to be rid of the unsettling presence. But as I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it following me. That night, I slept a little easier, telling myself the ordeal was over. But when I woke at 3:15 a.m. again, my blood ran cold. The doll was back, sitting on my dresser, its eyes now wide open and lifeless. Panic surged through me. How had it returned? Was someone playing a cruel joke, or was something more sinister at work? I decided to confide in my friend, Lisa, who was into the supernatural. She listened intently as I recounted the events, her expression growing more serious by the minute. "You need to find out where it came from," she said. "There might be something attached to it, a spirit or a curse." We spent the next few days researching, poring over old books and obscure websites. The more we learned, the more ominous the situation seemed. Dolls had long been used in rituals, vessels for spirits seeking to connect with the living. The eyes, it seemed, were a gateway, a way for whatever was attached to the doll to see into my world. Determined to break the connection, Lisa suggested a cleansing ritual. We gathered sage, salt, and candles, setting up a makeshift altar in my living room. As we chanted and waved the burning sage around the doll, I felt a strange mix of fear and hope. Maybe this would finally put an end to the nightmare. But as the ritual progressed, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The temperature dropped, and a palpable tension filled the air. The doll's eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, and I felt a pressure building in my chest, as if something were trying to force its way out. The candles flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Just as we finished the ritual, a loud crash echoed through the house. We ran to the source of the noise and found the doll on the floor, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the ritual hadn't worked. If anything, it seemed to have made things worse. Lisa looked at me, her face pale. "I think we need professional help," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something very wrong here." Reluctantly, I agreed. We reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a man named Marcus who had a reputation for dealing with cases like mine. He agreed to come over the next day. As night fell, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. I tried to sleep, but every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed to move. When I woke again at 3:15 a.m., I found the doll sitting at the foot of my bed, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. It opened its mouth, and in a voice that chilled me to the bone, it whispered, "I see you." Marcus arrived the next morning, a tall, stern man with a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened carefully as Lisa and I recounted the events of the past week, taking notes and occasionally nodding. When we finished, he looked at the doll with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "This is more than a simple haunting," he said. "There's a malevolent spirit attached to this doll. We need to find out why." Marcus began by setting up various pieces of equipment around my house: cameras, motion detectors, and EVP recorders. He explained that we needed to document any activity to better understand the entity we were dealing with. As night fell, the three of us settled into the living room, the doll placed on a table in the center, its eyes still and lifeless. The hours ticked by in tense silence, each of us watching the doll, waiting for something to happen. Just as the clock struck midnight, a sudden chill swept through the room. The lights flickered, and a low, whispering sound filled the air. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he strained to hear. "Do you hear that?" he asked. We nodded, the whispers growing louder, more distinct. It was a voice, soft and eerie, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The doll's eyes seemed to follow the sound, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Marcus picked up an EVP recorder, holding it towards the doll. "Who are you?" he asked. The whispering stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the room was deathly silent. Then, in a voice that sent chills through my entire body, the doll replied, "I am the one who sees." The lights flickered again, and a cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles we had lit. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, my heart pounding in my chest. Marcus sprang into action, drawing a circle of salt around the doll and chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The air seemed to crackle with energy, the room growing colder by the second. The doll's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. I felt a pressure building in my head, a sense of impending doom. Just as I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the whispers stopped, and the room fell silent once more. Marcus looked up, sweat dripping from his brow. "It's strong," he said, his voice shaky. "But I think we've weakened it for now. We need to find out more about where this doll came from. There has to be a reason it's targeting you." We spent the next few hours combing through the internet, searching for any clue that might explain the doll's origins. It was Lisa who finally found something, an old news article about a woman who had been found dead in her home, clutching a doll with sewn eyes. The article mentioned strange occurrences leading up to her death, unexplained noises, cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. My blood ran cold as I read the article. The woman's name was Margaret Johnson, and she had lived in a town not far from here. Her death had been ruled a heart attack, but the details were eerily similar to what I had been experiencing. "We need to go to her house," Marcus said. "There might be something there that can help us understand what's going on." As dawn broke, we gathered our things and prepared to leave. I felt a mix of fear and determination, knowing that whatever lay ahead, we had to face it. The doll remained on the table, its eyes closed once more, but I could still feel its presence, a dark shadow looming over us. We drove in silence, the weight of the past week's events hanging heavy in the air. When we arrived at Margaret Johnson's house, it was a dilapidated old building, its windows boarded up and the yard overgrown with weeds. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Stepping inside, the air felt thick and oppressive, the shadows whispering secrets from the past. As we made our way through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the doll's eyes were still on me, even from miles away. The inside of Margaret Johnson's house was like stepping into another world. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Each creak of the floorboards underfoot seemed to echo through the empty rooms, a ghostly reminder of the life that had once filled this space. Marcus led the way, his flashlight casting long shadows that danced on the walls. We found Margaret's bedroom at the end of a long hallway. The bed was unmade, clothes were scattered on the floor, and the wallpaper was peeling away. On the nightstand was a photo of Margaret, smiling with a doll clutched in her arms, the same doll that now haunted me. Seeing the photo sent a chill down my spine. Marcus set up his equipment, placing a few candles around the room and sprinkling salt in a protective circle. Lisa and I stood back, watching as he began another ritual, chanting softly. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to gather, pressing in around us. I could feel a presence, something dark and malevolent, lurking just out of sight. As Marcus chanted, the whispers began again, louder this time, more insistent. The candles flickered, and a cold wind swirled through the room, lifting the pages of an old diary that lay on the nightstand. Lisa grabbed the diary, flipping through the pages frantically. "Look at this," she said, her voice trembling. Margaret wrote about the doll. She said it was given to her by a stranger, that it watched her, that it wanted something from her. My heart pounded as Lisa read aloud. Margaret had tried to get rid of the doll, just as I had, but it always came back. She wrote about the eyes, how they seemed to see into her soul, how the doll spoke to her in her dreams, whispering dark secrets and terrifying visions. It had driven her to the brink of madness, and in her final entry, she wrote that she could feel it taking over, that she was losing herself to its power. The room grew colder still, and the whispers turned into a roar. The candles went out, plunging us into darkness. I could feel the presence, pressing down on us, suffocating. Marcus shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise, "We need to break the connection. There has to be something here, something that ties the doll to this place." In the chaos, I noticed a small, locked box under the bed. I grabbed it and forced it open, revealing a collection of old letters and a locket. The letters were from a man named Henry, professing his undying love for Margaret. The locket contained a picture of the two of them together, smiling, happy. But as I held it, I felt a jolt of recognition. The man in the photo looked just like me. A cold realization washed over me. The doll wasn't just a random curse, it was connected to me through Margaret and Henry. The spirit that haunted the doll had latched onto me because of my resemblance to Henry, a love that had been twisted into something dark and vengeful over the years. The eyes were its way of seeing me, of finding Henry once more. Marcus took the locket and placed it in the center of the salt circle, pouring more salt over it and chanting louder. The room seemed to vibrate with energy, the whispers rising to a deafening pitch. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something were trying to rip its way out. But then, with a final, desperate cry, the noise stopped. The room fell silent. The candles flickered back to life, and the oppressive weight lifted. I could feel the presence receding, the doll's power broken. Marcus looked exhausted but relieved. "It's over," he said. "The spirit has moved on." It was the locket, the connection to its past, that kept it anchored here. Now it's free. We left the house in a daze, the morning light filtering through the trees as we made our way back to the car. I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow, knowing that whatever had haunted me was finally at rest. but the memory of those eyes, of the whispers in the dark, would stay with me forever. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time. In the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing in the doorway, watching us. For a moment, I thought it was Margaret, smiling and free. But then the figure raised a hand, and I realized with a jolt of terror, it was the doll, its eyes wide open, staring straight at me. The end. Subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.